At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches EP17. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 2:34 Willesden 2 A black rose and a marked book were in his grasp. Willesden 2 arrived at Willesden High School, a huge grin on his face. This was the purpose he had to fulfill. This was the year he had been looking forward to since the day he was born. This was the tradition that had been passed down from generation to generation in his cursed family. His father in 1646 and 1746, his grandfather in 1446 and 1546, his great-grandfather in 1246 and 1346, and now him. His dates are September 3, 1846, and September 3, 1946. His father gave him those dates. Willesden was born on September 3, 1746, because his father had fulfilled his final duty. If Willesden did the same this year and 100 years later, he too would be rewarded with a son to live on for the next 200 years and pass the legacy. It was the only life he had ever known. The young man that appeared to be 20 years old was actually 100. His auburn hair appeared blonde at certain angles billowed in the light breeze. His smile widened into a chivalrous pearl-white grin that reached to the depths of his alluring green eyes. His presence in the middle of the courtyard was vibrant compared to the grim atmosphere. Although he wore a bland trench coat, his being was exuberant, much to the gray cloud's distaste. He stood there, peering into the grayness, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream. Amongst the dimly lit break of dawn, stood a gray Victorian-style school building. Willesden's chest puffed outwards with anticipation as his eyes darted from cracked windows to withering shrubs. He would be teaching students here for 100 more years. Except this year would be different. This year, he would be completing the first half of his lifelong mission. Before he could enter Willesden, a pair of skeletal hands tapped his shoulder. Willesden Stevenson too, the woman behind him said, as he turned to meet her piercing gaze. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her black dress, that had smears and tears as if it had been weathered by centuries of current. Strands of her obsidian hair billowed in the autumn breeze, while the rest of it was tied back in a tight bun. Although her most defining feature was the violet eyes that watched the Stevensons like a hawk, for millenniums. "Witch," he responded, a devious smile spread across his face. "Why must you call me a witch out in the open?" she asked, furrowing her eyebrows. "I am your mother." Willesden chortled and shot the witch a superior look. "Although the witch purges have mostly died out, I have lived through the 18th century, witch. I know you and I will be shunned if anyone finds out you are my mother, who also happens to be a witch. I figured that simply calling you a witch will jeopardize you, not me," he remarked, smirking. The witch arched her eyebrows, in the taunting manner that Willesden detested. "You must admit to yourself, Willesden Stevenson too, that this is quite ironic. You hate your witch mother, yet you are eager to receive her pagan powers today," she retorted, unfazed by his unruly behavior. Willesden pursed his lips and scoffed defensively. "I have been waiting for this day for a century." "There is a difference," he pointed out. The witch shook her head, her lips twitching into a sly smile. "I have been waiting for my dreams to be fulfilled for much longer than you." "A century compares little to a megaranum," she cheekily responded. It seemed the witch knew she had angered Willesden because before he could furiously retort any further, she swiftly swerved the topic of conversation. "Give me that book," the witch abruptly ordered as she outstretched her marked palm. Willesden snorted with sardonic disbelief and straightened his back pompously. "You want my pars de malleus maleficarum?" he questioned as a coy expression spread across his face. Willesden purposely stroked the frayed cover in front of the witch, taunting her with the way he ruthlessly handled the wretched book. "It is mine, not yours, Willesden Stevenson too," the witch scorned, rolling her violet eyes. "I need it for the ritual today." "It appears you have not paid attention during the schooling I gave you," she commanded, biting her lips in a vain attempt to suppress the rage that boiled through her at the way he handled the book. "Fine, take the book." "It is useless to me now that I have all the wonderful stories memorized," he retorted defensively. It irked him every time the witch nagged and got the better of him, although he still grudgingly passed the book to the woman. He learned at an early age as to never go too far when playfully teasing a witch. The witch grinned and opened the Pars de Malleus Maleficarum, flipping through the pages that had yellowed over time. Wilson gazed at the mysterious book that held countless tales of the innocent witch and the evil king. He had been raised to believe the innocent witch was truly innocent, and he did believe it for a time. That was until 84 years ago at the tender age of 16. He begged the witch to tell him more. So she told him the truth. He began to empathize with the evil king, his namesake. He began to root for the king's retarded brother, and supported his decisions in later life. Oh, to be such a heroic and adventurous king, Wilson recalled thinking. He wished that the monarchy had not been abolished, but there is not much one can do about events that happened centuries ago. Still, it made him wonder what king he would have been, had he been born a prince. Fortunately for the witch, hearing the truth did not backfire her plans of purposely wanting the Stevenson children to desire the curse. In fact, it propelled Wilson's greed and desire further. He desperately longed for this day, so that he could use his special powers to be gifted with a son. He was also hungry to have magic in his hands, and do whatever he pleased with it twice in his timely life. It had been difficult to imagine the magnitude of the feeling, but he was eager to explore it nonetheless. It did not matter to him that he appeared to be a monster who saw a graceful dance in the mirror, because Wilson truly did see a graceful dance. There was no other purpose for him after all. Wilson sighed heavily and turned to gaze longingly at the school, which reminded him of his special duty. It filled him with happiness once again, which had recently been diminished by the witch's curt remarks. Wilson excitedly approached the heavy iron-bound doors and pushed it open. To the library, yes? Wilson asked as the witch trailed behind him. Their feet squeaked against the varnished tiles, and scattered around the hall were flickering candles that lit their way. The mornings in Willesden were as dim as the twilights, so fiery candles were a regular occurrence. She said, nodding slightly as her nose was deep in the black book. As they walked through the grim corridors of Willesden, Wilson placed the black rose in his trench coat pocket. Beside him, the witch nervously pressed the marked book against her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around it. Wilson glimpsed down at the witch and pitied her. To be a witch this boring. What a dreadful life she must have lived. When they solemnly turned the corner, a teacher happened to be walking from the other side of the hall. He waved and jogged towards them, much to Wilson's dismay. He sighed and rubbed the temples of his forehead once he realized who it was. "Oh, I'll be damned if it ain't Stevenson," the jolly Augustus exclaimed, slapping Wilson's back. Wilson staggered forwards and caught himself before tumbling to the ground. "I wouldn't mind if you were to be damned," he miserably though. His eyes glinting with detest for a split second. Wilson forced a joyful smile, but inside his grim heart wrenched in disgust. "Augustus, what a pleasant surprise to see you here this early," he said, looking up at his fellow teacher. Augustus rolled his head skyward and laughed, while he slapped his knees heartily. "Well, it is the first day of school after all. Got to prepare for the damn children's arrival. Ho!" he exclaimed, bringing his briar-root pipe to his mouth and smoking through it. Wilson bitterly laughed and nodded with feigned agreement. "That is indeed extremely smart of you," he said, as he flashed Augustus a gritted-teeth smile. However, his eyes revealed all the hatred he held inside for every teacher at this school. Though it was not as if the absent-minded Augustus would be able to observe that. Beside him the witch scoffed. "It would be wise for you to leave, Augustus Fitzgerald. Wilson Stevenson too and I have important matters to attend to," she mistily remarked, her darkened eyes piercing Augustus. "That damn woman," Wilson thought, clenching his fists that were safely stowed away in his dress pant pockets. Unfortunately, he couldn't say anything about it, or else it would blow their cover. "Well, Augustus, I must go now," he cheerfully said instead. "Ho! See ya around, Stevenson," Augustus replied, waving and leisurely strolling past them. When Augustus turned the corner, Wilson turned to glower at the witch. "You are lucky, witch, that you are a witch. However, no matter how much you coat yourself with invisibility, never talk to the mortals again. Understand?" he commanded, his jade eyes bulging with fury. The snarky witch simply deadpanned. I am permitted to do what I please, Willesden丨. They cannot hear my voice. Enough with this matter. I have been waiting 100 years for this day, and you are constantly boring me with your defensive remarks. Willesden yelled as he turned to stomp towards the library. Willesden angrily pushed open the doors of the library and halted in his tracks to scan the darkly lit room. Willesden had been at this library many times before, with his students from previous years. Dust collected everywhere as far as he could see, and spider webs wove loosely around books, dirted shelves and stands. Overhead, withering vines hung from the cracked ceiling that had stood the test of time. The ground was littered with dirt, books and torn paper. The disordered fashion of it irritated Willesden for decades. Thankfully, the crevices in the wall allowed small slivers of dawn to spill inside, since no one had thought to light the candles within the library today. Are you ready, Willesden丨? The witch nonchalantly asked, as she elegantly glided to the middle of the cubicle library. The faint chirps of birds outside were all that could be heard in this vacant library, so their presence ruptured the silent atmosphere. Willesden nodded and puffed out his chest confidently. I have never been more ready, he proclaimed, as he trailed after the witch's timid footsteps. His temper quickly died out as the realization of everything hit him. It was happening right now. The ritual begins now. Stand still, Willesden丨. Do not move an inch and do not inhale a breath, she ordered, refusing to avert her gaze from the black book splayed open in her hands. In front of him, the witch raised her overturned palms to the sky and summoned the devil. Humans call this being Satan, but truly only the devil can create a witch, as Willesden learned from the witch. Willesden nodded and clenched his jaw shut, watching with his piercing emerald eyes as the witch split her soul and spilled her blood. Advoco diaboli, she chanted, her head tilted up to the dark ceiling. Strenuus me vires adversus paganos, she exclaimed in Latin, both hands outstretched to the sky. Suddenly, a gush of wind entered the room and the hem of her black dress whipped against her bare ankles. It seemed the devil had arrived. Sinditer volo anima mea, she earnestly requested to the devil. Suddenly, a ray of blinding light filled the room, which forced Willesden to squint through the light. He could barely see half of the witch's soul whisking away, through the openings of his crossed arms. The apparition that was in the shape of the witch left her body and slowly walked towards Willesden, dragging her left leg. The apparition was no more than a distortion of the light, a human cut out of uncanny colors. As it trudged towards Willesden, the things behind it appeared bowed, as if he was looking through a mild fisheye. Despite her ghostly and transparent color, her violet-hued eyes remained colorful and blazing. She limped towards him, with a malicious smirk spreading from ear to ear. She walked like she was painted onto the horizon with a fine brush, the artist constantly touching up and making alterations. Willesden swallowed the lump in his throat and his heart hammered at the frightening apparition, but he decided to fight back the urge to flee. He shut his eyes and outstretched his arms to welcome the witch's soul into his body. A fire burned within his lungs and scorched his limbs as the apparition entered. It was like a capricious desert sun had entered his body. Her form shimmered and waved as she traveled deep within to meet his former soul. Every lick of moisture within Willesden disappeared as the wreath of fire burned his skin, and he had to tighten his jaw to resist screaming with agony. Fortunately, it went by quickly. As the moment the apparition entered, the blinding light disappeared. The real witch stepped towards Willesden, her purple eyes drained of its usual life. Without wasting time to bat an eyelash, she grabbed his right wrist and overturned his hands to reveal his ruddy palms. Then with the tip of her sharp fingernails, she carved the devil's mark onto his palm. With each piercing stroke, crimson blood dripped from his hands, and a deafening scream escaped his mouth. One dark glare from the witch was enough to tell him to stand still, so he bit his quivering lips and endured the pain. A fountain of blood gushed from the wound, the ebb and flow in time with his terrified heart. It circled his arm and splattered to the floor, as he watched his skin being sliced apart with the witch's sharp fingernail. She carved 3 lines into his right palm, that connected to form a triangle. One thick line shot through the middle, and the witch dug her fingernail so deep that Willesden could see the white jagged bone popping from his palm. She lifted her fingernail for a moment, and Willesden silently let out a breath of relief. He peered at the flayed flesh upon his palm and scrutinized the triangular mark. Will this truly work? September 3 AXLVI. She called to the dark abyss. After a moment of still silence, the blood and flesh on her fingernail disintegrated. She lowered her fingernail to his palm once more and Willson winced at the frigid touch. Finally, she carved 9/3/1846 underneath the bloody wound, in perfect handwriting. The mark glowed a dark purple hue for a moment. Willson blinked, and then the glow disappeared as if it had simply been an illusion of his eye. He looked down at his palm and noticed that the blood had transformed into black ink, as if all that pain and torture he endured simply resulted in a tattoo. Willesden High, witch said, as the black book hovered above them, its marked pages glowering down at them. Do you vow to abide by the curse for the remainder of your timely life, and successfully fulfill your part of the pact? Willson swiftly regained his composure, and nodded without another second of hesitation. I vow to abide by the curse for the remainder of my timely life, and successfully fulfill my part of the pact, he proudly promised. The witch remorsefully sighed and nodded, before snapping her fingers. Volo autumn effundit sanguinem meum, diabolus, she chanted her final incantation, speaking to the coat of darkness cowering behind the bookshelves. Instantly, fresh blood spilled from her marked hand. She wrapped her bloody hands around Willson's, and the pact had been sealed for the 7th time. The black rose that had been placed in his pocket shriveled and died at their bloody touch. Flying out from the pages of the book, sprouted a fresh black rose. The witch grabbed it from the sky and handed it to Willson, who accepted it warily. Go fulfill your duty, Willesden High. You now have my pagan powers, so I will meet you in 1 year, to confirm that the first half of your lifelong mission has been successful, the witch said, her husky voice timid and weak. Willson traced his fingers along his marked palm and grinned like a deliriously happy child. Of course, witch, he exclaimed, repeatedly clenching his fist. The witch silently gulped and nodded, her face sickeningly pale and beads of sweat trickled down her face. Willson ignored her presence, as he would rather jump up and down with glee. She sighed and grudgingly limped away from the library, her energy drained. Finally, Willson exclaimed, pumping his fists in the air as the morning sun peeked through the windows. My special duty begins today. Willesden High widened his eyes with excitement. His cursed green glowing eyes. Willesden High, or better known as Mr. W. Stevenson by his precious students, could tell he was about to have an immense amount of fun this year. This was not an activity he did for leisure. He did it because it was his duty. Although he had to admit, his duty was quite pleasurable and satisfactory regardless of how he masked it. He had been waiting for this blessing since the day he was born, after all. Willesden High sauntered through the drab corridors of Willesden. It was after school hours and Willson had extreme plans. A devious grin spread across his face, and there was no need to withhold it, as the school was almost vacant. He had learned who his special students were this year before homeroom officially started. Some were students he had taught for years and some were new students. They all had two things in common. Firstly, the children all descended from witch hunters at some point within their bloodlines. Secondly, he could not care less about any of them. Willson entered the hallway with the lockers, eager to meet his first special student. However, there would be no formal meeting, rather there would be tormenting. A blonde-haired boy stood in the middle of the hallway, struggling with the books in his hands. As the freckled boy shut the locker with his shoulder, Willson crouched behind an ajar classroom door. He watched the boy for a while, recognizing his flaky blonde hair and doe-blue eyes. Joseph Parlow. As Joseph Parlow groggily trudged from his locker and towards the exit, Willson raised his right palm and slashed the air. I wonder what my shadow will transform into when he touches that marked boy. Willson eagerly murmured under his breath, watching with excited eyes. Dark mist spilled from his palm and pooled below him. The pool increased with thickness and slithered towards the boy, rising with every ticking second. The boy's back faced the other way, but he instantly stopped when the shadow touched his shoulder. The moment they made contact, the shadow transformed into Joseph's worst fear imaginable: loneliness. Willson knew that boy well, and he knew him even better now that his pagan powers touched him. He had taught him for a couple of years. He always sat in the back of the class yearning for a friend. So be it. I shall give Joseph Parlow a friend. Wilson smirked and snapped his fingers to multiply the darkness that swirled around the boy. The shadow strangled the boy and dragged him across the tiles, while darkness flooded his vision. His books clattered to the floor, as he tried his best to fight back with his scrawny arms. Joseph Parlow screamed with horror, extremely bewildered by what was occurring to him. All the innocent boy knew was that he was being tortured by some unknown monster, and that he had to fight back or die. It caused a sense of fulfillment to flood Wilson. He was satisfied to be that unknown monster hiding in the shadows, with all the power in the world to end someone's life. He finally had a purpose. Joseph Parlow yelled for help, but the school was just as lonely as he was, and nobody except the strangling shadow was his friend. Wilson wished to continue for longer, but since this was the first time he used these supernatural powers, he quickly became drained. No matter. I shall continue tomorrow until I find the perfect time to kill him off. I believe I will enjoy torturing him and the others in the meantime anyways. With a swift clap of his hands, the slithery shadow reeled back into his right palm, resting and regaining strength for tomorrow's paranormal activity. Joseph Parlow dropped to the floor, sucking shaky breaths from the thick air. He swiveled his head to scan the corridors and find a source for his terror, as it was a natural human response. He rubbed his eyes and burning neck, to ensure that what happened was real and not a nightmare. Joseph Parlow casually glimpsed down at his blistered palms, as it seemed a burn stemmed from there. He gasped and Wilson grinned. Joseph Parlow was officially marked. The next school day quickly went by, with Wilson's eyes glued onto Joseph. He noticed the shift in his behavior, and it was apparent he was traumatized by the attack. From the way he adjusted his collar uncomfortably to the way he hid his crying face behind his books, it amused Wilson to no ends. Wilson noticed a lot of things since the boy was marked, as he could track his every movement and feeling. It was intriguing for a while, swimming through Joseph's naive and dark 16-year-old mind. He was eager for his next special student. She walked nonchalantly through the hallways, lost in her own fabricated dream. She hummed a sweet melody that would soon turn into an ominous rhythm. Wilson eyed the girl, and judging by her long auburn hair and mentally insane personality, she was Matilda Fitzgerald. Did it sadden or pain him one bit that he was about to torment Augustus' daughter? Not at all. Not even a pang of doubt or guilt circled his thrilled brain. Matilda wandered the halls during lunchtime mindlessly. She was known for that kind of thing. The other students would call her Matilda the retarded, Matilda the insane, Matilda the lunatic. Matilda the marked she soon will be. Wilson hid behind the corner wall and snapped his fingers from his right hand. Dark mist poured from his palms and floated towards Matilda, hissing menacingly along the way. The atmosphere grew thick as the dim light that had been peeking through the windows previously instantly evaporated. The darkness shrouded her for a moment, and then it evaporated at their touch. Matilda resumed skipping through the hallways as if nothing had happened. Perhaps she truly is insane, Wilson thought, furrowing his brows. Or the devil lied to me when he told me she was one of the marked. He was about to walk away until Matilda suddenly levitated in the air. Her book she held broke free from her grip and floated upwards with her. She gasped, wondering for a second whether she truly was insane. The devil never lies, he recalled the witch telling him. A grin spread from ear to ear on Wilson's relieved face. It took another moment before Wilson was filled with the knowledge of her fear. Being different. Wilson knew the girl for a while, and never cared to emphasize with her. Although, it suddenly amused Wilson when he was hit with a realization. The girl feared being different when she is exactly what she feared. The boy feared being lonely when he is exactly what he feared. No matter how much one shakes their fist at the sky, there is no changing the irony of life. The floating books circled Matilda and the pages ripped apart, as she flipped upside down in the air. Her long hair covered her face as it flipped, but that did not conceal her piercing screams. She shook her body furiously, so the inked pages flapped towards her and chained her wrists and ankles. That only resulted in more deafening screams, but it did an excellent job of straining her. The papers not only strangled her mid-air, but also twisted her limbs harshly like a puppet. Her right arm went over and around her head, her left leg twisted around her waist, her right leg pulled upwards, and her left arm wrapped around her chest in the opposite direction. Her neck was about to spin off her head, but unfortunately, Wilson was drained of his powers before any real damage could be done. It didn't bother him much, because seeing his powers in action brought him extreme joy. Besides, she received a mark afterwards, and he was granted access to her mentally unstable mind. What a thrill ride that was! The paranormal activity was like that. For 6 consecutive days, a new mark would appear on the predetermined person. Then, after he was able to delve deep in their minds and personalize the paranormal attacks further, he continued. Day after day, he activated his pagan powers and played games with the children. He waved his palm in the air at the brown-haired boy who played bat and ball games in the field, causing a coat of endless darkness to surround him. He watched with a childlike giddiness at the red-haired girl who was about to take a bite from her baguette until scurrying spiders vomited from her mouth instead. Although those harmless pranks amused him, nothing entertained him more than the tricks that would result in injuries. He snickered as the black-haired boy washed his hands in the water basin of the boys' washroom, only to realize the mirror in front of him had no reflection. Then, he turned around and was face to face with a life-size raven, who chomped his left arm without batting an eyelash. He chortled at the tan-skinned girl who was locked in a closet, after creating a hound within that same closet. He expected what would happen after she tumbled out of that closet, but no one could prepare for the real gruesome thing. Those were perhaps the best memories he had at this otherwise drab school. What made the whole situation eons of times better was the fact that the poor students were too dumb to realize that what was happening to them was not a nightmare. They didn't even begin to suspect that their friendly homeroom teacher was the one behind their turmoil. And that was what made it riveting. A year passed and he had successfully killed the 6 marked students. Their corpses laid on the ground below him, as he sat on the gray chair with blood-stained hands. He peered into Joseph Parlow's devoid eyes and Matilda Fitzgerald's translucent skin, as he waited for the witch to arrive. His cursed green, glowing eyes skittishly darted around the 6 corpses, dry and fresh blood gushing from their wounds and slashes. Some were pitted with burrowed insects and some had limbs that already decayed. Without eyelids, their innocent eyes stared up at the gray ceiling of room 100, while their lipless mouths hung open. William Stevenson too could not bring himself to turn away, although his stomach heaved and his nostrils filled with the smell of rotting meat. His blood-stained hands began to tremble and shake, and he could not do anything to stop it. His heart hammered erratically against his chest and his lower lip quivered. He had yearned for this for years, so why? Why did he feel scared? Wilson bit his lips as Joseph Parlow, his first marked student, stared up at him with dead eyes. That one lifeless look told him the answer. Wilson Stevenson too sighed heavily at the pile of bodies in front of him, and brushed the feeling that gnawed at his brain. It's best not to get attached to them, he reminded himself for the second half of his lifelong mission, in 100 years. 35 The Witch. The witch did not know why she split herself open for someone who never bothered to show her the thread. She had lived for millions of years at this point, and if her birthday was the day the earth was created, she wouldn't be surprised. She had more wisdom and knowledge than the oldest living human, yet she allowed herself to be fooled by temporary luxuries. What was she thinking 690 years ago? William Stevenson caught her at a vulnerable stage in her life, and the cunning man took advantage of that. The promise to give her eons of rich lands, multiple enormous bags filled with gold coins, and a wonderful room in a dazzling castle for her to live in, was now a dream from long ago. The eons of rich lands had been salvaged upon by the modern men, with their buildings and factories. The multiple enormous bags filled with gold coins had all been used by her sons over centuries, for their own greedy needs. And that wonderful basement in a dazzling castle was obliterated after the monarchy died out. It angered her that the cunning Stevenson she had devoted her life to gave her nothing in return, while they gained everything imaginable. It was all for naught, her plan to sabotage the Inquisition because the witch purges occurred for centuries. No matter how many witch hunters the Stevensons killed, it would never teach those men a lesson. While her current son, Wilson Stevenson II, was off trotting around Willesden High School, she was still recovering from splitting her soul for the 7th time. She also had to prepare for the second term of Wilson Stevenson II, which was approaching fast. Decades flashed by like days to her, especially during the significant year when they turned 200. Not only did she have to split her soul once more to give Wilson Stevenson to her pagan powers, but she also had to spread her legs to conceive the reward she promised. The devil had cursed her many years ago, so she could only conceive every 200 years. If only she hadn't been cursed. Then perhaps the Stevensons would live and die in a matter of decades instead of centuries. If things had worked out that way, the witch hunters would have been purged millennia ago, and her innocent sisters would have lived fruitful lives. It was a pity that all the men in her life were such irritable pieces of rubbish, including the devil. Upon more thought, she decided to give an exception to that one courteous dark-haired boy she met during her girlhood. But even he was too cowardly to dance with a witch. The witch sighed as she sat on the golden sand, the pebbles and stones prickling her underneath. There was not much she did during her day, especially as the modern era approached. She used to enjoy cursing random passerbys, but that was in the 1600s, and she foresaw that it made her no different from her son, so she stopped. Occasionally, when the days were too silent, she would snap her fingers and eavesdrop on some of the strangers' conversations. Or better yet, swim through their minds and absorb what they were thinking. Nowadays, all the prissy housewives could talk about was the rumors about the upcoming war, and how dreadful it would be to send their valorous husbands away. The witch scoffed every time she heard their conversations, grateful that she was not chained to a husband. Although she was chained to a devil, so perhaps their lives weren't all that terrible in comparison. Sometimes she was jealous of humans. Oh, to live a life without having to lurk behind the shadows, for fear that someone would notice her devil's mark and hang her for being a witch. Sometimes she felt superior over humans. Such foolish beings they were, trotting around with their heads held high as if they were the smartest creatures on earth. Sometimes she would appreciate humans, for they created such interesting places such as the beach, a place she enjoyed spending her quiet days at. Did humans create the beach? Or was it simply a phenomenon created by Mother Nature? The witch should know, for she has lived for millions of years, yet she did not. She blamed the Stevensons for this lack of knowledge, as it was because of them she split herself open for men who never bothered to show her the thread. The witch tilted her head and gazed at the beach that stretched out alongside the sapphire water. In the gentle spring sunshine, she felt as if she were swimming in the briny aroma, and as if the new rays of the day brought a free zone of energy to her ashen fingertips. The gulls brought their beaks to the percussion of pebbles at the shoreline. It was a day for dreaming, for allowing time to move fast and slow. Those saline waves ascend as rain to a desert, a gift never repaid. As it always is with nature, the strong give, life thrives, and so it goes on. As she gazed at the horizon, someone interesting struck her attention. The witch craned her neck to peer at the intruding figure and squinted to observe him. He was kneeling in the sand, his obsidian eyes moving from the coast to stone, from rock pools to breaking waves. His dark silky hair gently billowed in the breeze, as his crouched back faced her. From afar, he had the appearance of a young boy, and after scrutinizing him for longer, the witch concluded that he was in fact a child. The witch blinked rapidly as her breath hitched in her throat. Could it be him? No, it could not, because that courteous dark-haired boy she met during her girlhood should be long dead by now. Still, he piqued the witch's interest. The witch stayed in her position on the sandy beach but decided to eye the boy and watch what he did. He picked up a withering stick that appeared bony and sharp like a witch. He carved coarse lines in the damp sand, allowing his hands to fly freely like a bird as he turned and swished the stick. It was as if his mind directed his hand, moving instinctively to the right spot and building a picture he had never seen before. Suddenly, a throb burned within her right palm. She looked down and widened her eyes at the glowing mark. An impulse. The devil's impulse. This time, the witch knew she had to approach the boy, for there was no dismissing the devil. The tip of the triangular mark burned more fiercely than the other areas, and it acted as a compass, directing her towards the boy. There was something about that boy. Something strange that she couldn't quite put her finger on. She hastily stood up from the ground and brushed off the sand from her dark gown. The witch clasped her hands neatly in front of her dress and solemnly walked towards the boy who sat alone on the shoreline. Pagan. He was pagan just like her. She could sense it now that she was in his radius. Perhaps he had pagan ancestors somewhere along the line. That seemed most likely because even the boy did not know he was pagan. The witch blinked and her head buzzed, as she swam through the boy's mind. No, he has the same blood as the witch, that is why he was partly pagan. Perhaps an ancestor of hers married an ancestor of his. The witch knew a lot of things, but she did not know how this happened. She had no ancestors or family, besides a human mother who birthed her millions of years ago. She was her own clan, tribe, dynasty, and family. How could this have happened? However this happened, it was bad. Very bad indeed. From behind him, she silently raised her right palm. She would have to do this now, and there was no time for debate. That boy has pagan blood, and if the devil found him, he would be cursed for millions of years just like her. She was saving him, she told herself. Saving him from years of suffering, saving him from a chained life, saving him. But he was a child. A 6-year-old child. He was a child with at least 90 years ahead of him. He should live a normal life that had not been cut short by a witch he couldn't see. But the devil had his eyes on her and monitored her every movement. She was a witch after all. In a matter of time, the devil would realize that she had found a boy with similar blood to hers. The witch knew the devil very well. She knew that he will eagerly jump up at the opportunity of creating a new witch. But he looked so much like that courteous dark-haired boy she met during her girlhood. Suddenly a realization hit her. It came from the free will of her mind, the tiny section that had not been shackled by the devil. There was something about that pagan boy, something strange, yet something so liberating. All the puzzle pieces suddenly fit together, and the loophole to the curse she had been searching for so long was right in front of her. He had the potential to be of use to her. He had the potential to end all of the curses that had been performed on her, and that she had performed. The boy peered down at the image he created. Rather, the image she planted for him. After she left the dark pool that was his mind, 3 lines were drawn in the sand that connected to form a triangle. A line shot through the middle. The witch smirked and leaned down to tap his shoulder, as the coat of invisibility she painted over herself disintegrated. The boy looked up and peered at the strange figure standing behind him. She smugly stared down at him, as her dark robe spilled from her lanky body, the excess fabric swishing in the breeze. The ocean breeze tousled her raven-black hair, that was tied loosely in a bun. Her crooked nose sneered down at him like a hawk's beak, and it amused her how her hollow cheeks frightened the boy. The witch made sure the miniature details of her face were hazy and blurred to him, except for her memorable piercing violet eyes. She foresaw that one day those memorable eyes would be needed. She whispered an incantation, her lips barely moving. Restringere ius motus. The boy tried to open his mouth to speak, but his movements were restricted. Only his eyes had the freedom to roam around the woman in front of him. The witch nodded satisfactorily and kneeled beside him, digging her bony knees in the sand. She gracefully snatched the stick from the young boy's hand and curled her skeletal fingers around the base. She crushed the stick in the sand and started moving it, writing around his drawing. Below the devil's mark he had drawn, the witch scrawled the date of Wilson Stevenson's second term. 9/3/46, it read in shaky handwriting. Paganorum mea debo illi potestatum. She murmured another incantation underneath her breath. And this time the devil noticed. The devil was infuriated, the witch could tell. Although she was unfazed, as a smug grin twirled on her face. Finally it was going to happen. The day she longed for millions of years. Not even the devil could stop her because this time she was swaying him. The boy flickered his black eyes towards the witch beside him, his body still paralyzed. She craned her neck to meet his gaze and cracked a wicked smile. "You're a witch, Yuta." Indeed he was a witch. A boy who had been wrongfully gifted the powers of a witch. 2:36 Wilson. What a wonderful morning it is, Mrs. Briggs. Yes, you are right. Mrs. Briggs exclaimed in response, clutching her binders against her chest. It's nice to see you again this year, Mr. Stevenson, she timidly added as her cheeks reddened. I will be here every year, Mrs. Briggs. I'm not planning to leave Willesden anytime soon, Mr. Stevenson replied, winking at her. He chuckled as Mrs. Briggs' jaw dropped to the floor and her binders clattered with it, before waving her farewell. Wilson swiveled his head and his grinning face fell the moment he walked away from Mrs. Briggs. He rolled his eyes as he rushed past the gray corridors of Willesden, who were watching him intently. Willesden noticed a figure in his peripheral vision and tilted his head, a grin spreading across his face once more. "What a wonderful morning it is, Coach McGurty." Coach McGurty jumped up with surprise and her features lit up when she met his gaze. "Why yes, Mr. Stevenson, it is. I'm glad to spend another year with you," she stammered, blushing intensely. "I agree, McGurty," he said, flashing a pearl-white smile. Willesden trotted past her, his brownish-blondish hair swirling amongst the wind he created. His forced grinning face fell the moment he walked away. "What a wonderful morning it is, indeed," he murmured to himself, his lips curving into a playful smirk. Willesden peered down at his glowing palm and hastily stirred the air with it as he walked through the empty hallways. A dark purple flare erupted from the mark and he eagerly slapped it with his free hand, causing the flare to burst. The sparks fell onto the ground beside him, flickering and hissing like a hearth. The sparks rose from the ground and transformed into a shadow. It was a human-like shadow, with limbs and a blackened face, that could swivel and trod. He stood like a piece of the night, as if someone had cut carefully around him and peeled him away, leaving only blackness behind. "Hello there," Willesden said smugly, as the newborn shadow wobbled around. "You will be my new pet. Or friend if that helps you sleep at night. Follow me and do as I say, Shadow." The shadow timidly nodded and straightened its hunched back. It trailed after Willesden as he turned the corner and approached his homeroom classroom. Room 110. Willesden heaved a sigh of relief and joy as he unbuttoned his beige trench coat and hung it around the wooden coat rack. Willesden eagerly unzipped his briefcase, enjoying and indulging himself within the posh and prim lifestyle of the 40s. From his briefcase, he pulled out his necessary paperwork and binders. Resting at the bottom was the new green journal he bought from a second-hand market. Willesden tossed the other items onto his desk and pulled the journal out like a child receiving his first Christmas present. Willesden swept his palms over the cover and was very much enjoying himself until the shadow tapped his shoulder. Willesden turned to where the shadow was pointing and widened his eyes that were raked with annoyance. "Oh God," he groaned, grinding his teeth. "That saying is quite an insult to Satan, is it not? However, I believe there is no Satan because I have met the devil." Many people believe that Satan and the devil are interchangeable or one entity, when they are not, at least from my experience. The devil can turn me into a witch, that's the difference. But what do I know of Satan and the devil? I know little, just like you. I simply believe that there is no Satan and only the devil, who is perhaps the same to some but truly are different. That begs the question, where does God fit in all this? I am a pagan witch and I know many things, but this I do not know, for I worship many gods and goddesses. You must be wondering why I am saying all this. I suppose it's because today I have the freedom to say whatever I wish about the devil, and here is what I say about the devil. The devil shall rot in his own hell, where he belongs, and die a wretched death. That is what I wish to say about the devil. She cracked a wicked grin. One leg crossed over the other as she sat comfortably upon a desk near the cracked window. Her hands were clasped neatly in front of her black dress and her black boots twirled in the air smugly. It was as if she was in that position minutes before his arrival, even though they had met minutes ago. What are you doing here?" he asked with narrow eyes and a contorted face that was full of loathing. "You look incredibly happy today, Willesden Stevenson too," she pointed out, looking incredibly happy herself. "Yes, I was, until you suddenly appeared in my classroom. I thought I told you to leave after this morning," he grunted, gripping his green journal that he was excited about seconds ago. "That damn woman. That damn witch. She always finds a way to ruin my mood and my best days with her nonsensical ramblings." The witch pouted in a sarcastic manner. "I simply wanted to spend time with my dearest son." "Well, your dearest son appreciates the sentiment, but he has a class full of teenagers to teach and a couple of marked kids to kill, so he's quite busy at the moment." "Sorry for the inconvenience," he sardonically retorted, walking around his desk and plopping down on the chair. The witch wiggled her eyebrows tauntingly and jumped down from the desk, whizzing past the dumbfounded shadow. "What is that?" she scorned, shooting the shadow a disgusted look. "Your first friend." Willesden rolled his eyes at the witch's mockery. "He is my new companion. He will be of great help to keep track of where my mark students are. Once I figure out who they are and mark them, of course," he explained, while smoothly grabbing the new black rose from his shirt pocket. He looks a lot like myself, does he not? It seems the impressionable lad has taken my form. He chuckled to himself. And what is that? She bitterly questioned, nodding towards the green journal that was in his grasp. A book. Do you recall that you cannot read those without your dearest mother, Wilson Stevenson too? It is a journal. Although an old woman like you wouldn't know about the latest fads, Wilson wittily remarked, laying the black rose on top of his journal. I am supposed to write daily entries, and frankly I'm excited to. It will be like I'm writing a diary about my intriguing life, except it's in a journal, which is niftier. I suppose I'll add a few excerpts about my fresh pagan powers that you graciously gifted me earlier today. And perhaps a couple of mentions about my doings with these powers, Wilson added, chuckling to himself. He stared dreamily up at the ceiling, pondering about all the prospects of what a man could do with pen and paper. Although he didn't allow himself to get too excited over it, because he knew a man could do greater things with magic. Writing about your daily life on paper. How pathetic, the witch snappily remarked, shaking her head with disdain. Well, what's pathetic is trotting around on a high horse all day when you should be at a senior care home, Wilson retorted, probing the witch with his eyes. Enough with the pointless banter, Wilson Stevenson too, the witch spat, placing her palms on the wooden desk and leaning forward. Her violet eyes narrowed as they neared Wilson's, and they held something Wilson was curious to find out about. For the record, I officially dropped the suffix of my name. It made it much easier to discard all records Willesden had of me decades ago, and eased my transition into the new era, Wilson pointed out, grinning mischievously. Anyways, what brings you here? I have known you for a long time, witch. You didn't just come here to make witty remarks against your dearest son, he asked, in a tone that was far from genuine. The witch huffed and smirked, enjoying the superior stance she had when he was sitting and she was standing. I have come to tell you about a situation that occurred recently. Oh, Wilson said, tilting his head up with curiosity. And what exactly is the matter of this situation? Good or bad? Please tell me it's good, which because I have no room for negativity on this joyous day, he added as his legs bounced eagerly underneath the table. He was desperate for the bell to ring so the witch could leave and he could finally meet his marked students. It is a bad situation. Very bad indeed, she nonchalantly said, a smile spreading across her face as she crossed her arms mischievously. Wilson did not like that smile one bit, as his face fell at that comment. What do you mean? He hissed through gritted teeth. What did you do, witch? What did you do, woman? It irritated him to a limitless degree that her violet eyes were flickering with superior mischief. Wilson gnawed on his lower lip and suppressed his temper because he knew the witch for a long time. The more he gave her the reaction she wanted, the longer she would withhold the object of his desire. What a terrible mother she is. I went to the beach as recently as 10 years ago, the witch finally said, her lips curving into a playful smirk as she looked down at Wilson. There I met a peculiar boy. He was a random stranger sitting on the shoreline alone. I suppose I will never see him again, which saddens me a little. Although, I foresaw that you will see him again in a matter of time. Wilson's jumping heart slowed when he realized that the witch was simply tricking him. She did it to irritate Wilson and he had to admit, she did her job extremely well. You damn woman. What is all this nonsense? Why must you scare me for nothing but the thrill of scaring me? He exclaimed, rubbing the temples of his forehead exasperatedly. The witch arched her eyebrows with a knowingness but dismissed Wilson's question. I passed all my pagan powers to that random stranger, who also happened to have pagan blood himself. What a coincidence, she continued, in a purposeful flat manner she knew would bother Wilson. Wilson's brain stuttered for a moment and his entire being paused as his slow thoughts caught up with her words. Her words jumbled and bounced around his shocked brain as he registered the disastrous situation. He was so shocked that his lower lip quivered. It was slow at first, but then the tremor increased rapidly as if he had a spasm. Wilson slowly rose from his seat as the realization that his pagan powers would leave loomed over him with intense detriment. This was his purpose in life. This was the reason he continued to march forward for 200 years, walking past the idea of killing himself so many times so the slow torture of aging could be done away with. He marched forward so that he could reach this destination. This destination was supposed to be fulfilled and completed by the end of today, just as the heroic King William did in that black book. Today was supposed to be his last day teaching at Willesden. At midnight, he was supposed to receive a son. Tomorrow, he was supposed to spend an entire day with his prodigal newborn. The next day, in the early morning, he was supposed to hand over his son to the witch, the woman he trusted to raise his son, and die. The second half of his lifelong mission was supposed to end today. He was supposed to be free tomorrow for simply one day. But that one day was worth waiting for 200 years. His quivering lips suddenly turned into maniacal laughter. Willesden Stevenson doubled himself over and burst into a fierce cackle of laughter. He rolled his head skyward and was writhed with never-ending chuckles. He could not help himself in this exasperated situation, as his future that was set in stone the day he was birthed crumbled in front of his enraged eyes. What? He suddenly thundered, slamming the table with his fists. His precious dusty green journal and black rose jumped in the air at the sheer force. A few snickers and snorts escaped him, as he glowered at the witch. His grin was lopsided because behind the forced chuckles that kept him sane, was the insane rage that pulsed through his boiling blood. Why did you do this? How did you do this? Why would you betray me, your dearest son? Why would you betray the devil for God's sake? He yelled, his anger cutting his laughter short. The witch jumped with a little surprise before she hastily interjected. That saying is quite an insult to Satan, is it not? However, I believe there is no Satan. Shut up, woman. Willesden shouted, and in another fit of rage, slammed his fists against the table. What the hell were you thinking? He seethed as his emerald eyes glowed amber with fire. Explain to me how and why. Immediately, woman, for I have no more patience to bicker with you. Tell me what will happen to me and the promise you made. You promised me a son. Where is my son? Willesden roared, slamming the table until his fists were sore, but even then, he continued to punch the table. The witch slowly stepped backwards, aware that if she was within Willesden's radius for longer than a second, he would slam her too. She was irritably calm throughout his rampage, and that only fueled his nerves even more. Willesden, calm yourself, she said nonchalantly, the tails of her lips discreetly upturned. Do you take me for a fool? I did not do anything about this terrible curse for centuries because no risk-worthy opportunity showed up. But then I found that pagan boy and terrible curse. Willesden exploded, raising his balled fists in the air and shaking it furiously. Are you mad, woman? That curse is a blessing that you have cheated me of, so stop looking so amused by my downfall. I spent the last 200 years waiting, and only 1 year did I get to perform any serious action. What is the problem, witch? Did you favor my father and his father before him more than myself? The witch narrowed her violet eyes, his statement angering her. Are you mad, Willesden Stevenson, too? Your father was the most cowardly man I have ever seen. It was because of his foolish desire to spend an extra day with you, the devil punished me. All the Stevensons I have met and birthed turn out to be cunning men. You are no exception, Willesden Stevenson, too. Then why is this happening to me? Why are you taking the blessing from me? Willesden hissed, his gripping the sides of his desk so harshly that his knuckles turned white. If you would just let me explain, the witch said, sighing heavily as her temper simmered down. Why did you jump to such conclusions? As I was saying, I found that special pagan boy and saw my opportunity. I took this opportunity to betray the devil and his curse that he bestowed upon us all for one reason only, Willesden Stevenson, she said, as her voice gradually grew quiet and somber. I am tired. Willesden blinked as his pacing breath slowed down. The tension in the room died as the witch cast her gaze onto the ground, and it was the first time Willesden had seen emotion on her face besides smugness and grimness. His chest heaved and with each exhale his fury vanished, while he stared at the witch with befuddlement. What do you mean? I am tired of everything, Willesden Stevenson, she said softly, as wisps of her charcoal hair fell over her drooped face. I am tired of birthing every 200 years. I am tired of giving the son I birthed to my previous son. I am tired of watching my previous son die as I hold his son's baby in my arms. I am tired of raising the new son without his father. I am tired of cursing my new son every 100 years. I am tired of birthing my new son's son every 200 years. I am tired of giving the new son I birthed to my previous son. I am tired, Willesden Stevenson. I am tired of the cycle that continues and will continue for the rest of eternity. It does not matter that the monarchy has been abolished, and that there is no present need for a new son. The devil does not care. You have no choice but to continue the curse and pass it on to your son. I have no choice but to watch it all unfold for millennia. Do you understand, Wilson Stevenson? I am tired of you Stevensons. I am tired of birthing. I am tired of the curse upon your family and myself. I am tired of the devil. But most of all I am tired of living. Witch, he murmured, gazing at her with an expression that could not express the whirlwind of emotions within him. He was at a loss for words, and his arms dangled uselessly by his side. The shadow had long disappeared, frightened by Wilson's anger, and shall return when Wilson called him. He tried to paint his feelings onto his face, to show the witch that he learned something, that he felt something. But he could not. There were too many strong, colorful emotions that one mere man cannot express. The droplets of tears that brimmed his eyes were unseeable, but the tears that dripped down her face could be seen from miles away. She lifted her head and met his gaze, as her brows knitted and a sheen of water filled her sunken violet eyes. She looked tired, that was true. Her bun that was once firmly tight was now loose, and strands of her hair tumbled down her shoulders like a tedious waterfall. The black gown that was once fresh and fitted her as if it was another layer of skin was now smeared and drooped, unable to swish in the breeze gracefully. The white tunic she wore underneath to remind her of a time long gone by was now thinner than air and lost all its comfort. The black boots lost their soles and had been gnawed at by insects for a much longer time than he was alive. She was aging extremely slowly, and her youthfulness was covered behind the thick layer of wisdom. Too much wisdom, too much knowledge. This woman was past her time. She overstayed her life. Wilson had thought 200 years was a pain, but this was something else. This woman had lived longer than time could measure. This woman had seen everything from the cultivation of mankind to their wars, peace treaties, riots, construction, destruction, and technologies. She had watched the continuous cycle of generations of children grow old in the blink of an eye, and leave their own children to lead the world. She had seen the sun and moon, angels and devils, light and dark, love and hatred, joy and heartbreak, company and loneliness, justice and injustice. She had seen the blacks and whites of nature, and the shade in between. Gray. She tried to stop seeing. She tried to start doing. She took action when the church ordered an inquisition against her people, her sisters. Yet, in the end, even she did not have the power to save her sisters because she could not save herself. It seemed that the devil had cursed her so that all she could do was hide within her nest of trees and vines, and simply watch. Watch for Megaanum. To her years would come and go, and she could not pause and rest. Something tugged at his heart. Something dreadful and bleak, but that something was right in doing so, right in being so. He allowed it to tug for a little longer, and grow into something he could accept. Wilson Stevenson, she said, her voice shaking as she forced herself to continue. I have not forgotten about you when I did this. So that's why I decided to pass all my pagan powers to that boy. Thus, I shall be a witch no longer, and you will have a choice to make. A choice. He breathed as his emerald eyes widened. That boy has now taken my place. He is a witch who was not turned into a witch traditionally. Instead, I forced my powers unto him, and his pagan blood eagerly absorbed it. Traditionally, a devil can turn a man or woman into a witch, through a collaboration. Since he has not collaborated with the devil, he cannot activate his powers the same way I can, she explained, pausing to inhale sharply and regain her composure. Therefore, you must mark that boy the same way you would mark the people the devil has predetermined for you. If the devil has not predetermined that specific boy, you must force the mark unto him. When you do so, your two options will be available for you to choose from. What will happen if I fail to mark him? Wilson asked, his shoulders slouching as he tentatively digested the information. And what is his name? The witch tilted her head ominously, her lips pressed into a firm line. The same thing that would happen if you supposedly had not completed your original task successfully. His name is Utah. Anyways, you still have my pagan powers that I gave to you this morning, and currently I have no more left. The reason I gave all my power to the boy 10 years before was that the devil slowly restores my powers over time. Half of my powers had been restored during that time, and I gave the remaining to you. Now that I am completely drained, the devil will not forgive me when he finds out about this trickery, she said, staring into Wilson's eyes with not sternness, but fierce determination. I made my decision at the beach hastily, and the devil was delayed in receiving information about my whereabouts. Now, this power I have given you will last for a year, just like in 1846. Originally, your second term is supposed to be shorter than your first, but you will be stuck with my powers for a year. I extended that through my chance I performed this morning. What are my two options? He asked with a heavy, sulking heart. He could not even begin to imagine how it would feel to have ripped her soul apart 7 times before, coupled with all of her powers being drained. Perform your special duty as you did 100 years ago. Take your time, for you have a year. There is no choice but for you to torment those marked children until you successfully kill them before the end of the year. As I said, after you mark the boy one way or another, you will have to make a choice about the new witch. You will have to find him and tell him about his pagan powers. Then you must claim his as your son, because for this to work, you must abide by the original curse. Tell him to speak the incantation, ego sum filius prodigus. Then it will work. He will be your son that shall continue the curse, for the rest of time. Since he is a witch and also your heir, he will be chained to the curse forever. He will never die thereafter because the devil will not allow it. He will play the part as the witch and the man with the special duty at the same time, so there will be no need for a son to continue his job, and no one else has to suffer. Think of it as if you and I found a way to break free from some shackles, but the only way to do it without sounding an alarm is to sneakily remove it and pass it on to someone else, the witch explained. In her determined eyes he could see that this time she was going to take calculated action. It seemed she learned from her mistakes during her attempt to stop the witch trials. She learned that the devil must not be trusted and can be swayed. Wilson swallowed the lump in his throat and hesitated before speaking because the weight of the situation was enormous. What will happen to me afterwards? What will happen after? When the boy witch who I claim to be my heir continues the curse forever? He asked, fumbling with his hands. You will die. Just like it was stated in the original curse, you will die after you receive a son and complete your 2 tasks. Wilson's lips parted with surprise. If I choose this option, everything will continue normally and nothing about the curse will be broken. Excellent, witch! He exclaimed excitedly, not at all bothered by the fact he will die. He always knew this was the year he was going to die, and he was glad that he was going to finally have it with the knowledge that his son would continue his legacy. Do not forget the second option, Wilson Stevenson, she reminded gently. Firstly, I must point out that the boy must be willing and agree to one of these 2 options. It's the same with you and me, and the men before you. I persuaded the young children using the stories I wrote within the Pars de Malleus Maleficarum, so that they were willing to perform their special duty. You must persuade him somehow when the time comes, she added, her firm eyes staring intently into his. The second option is a lot worse than the first, so it seems likely the boy will agree with the first. However, if he chooses not to, then the only option left is for him to kill himself. If the boy kills himself, it will thereby kill you because he is the witch currently connected to you via the curse. Afterwards, the pact will go to waste unless the devil chooses to intervene, although he rarely does. I do not understand what you mean, witch. The pact will go to waste. He asked, taking slow breaths. She does not mean the pact. The curse. It will all vanish. It will be erased forever and will never resurface because by then the 2 witches that are currently on this earth will have died, she solemnly answered, her hands folded neatly over the front of her black dress. Wilson paused to digest this information until one of her words hammered at his brain. So the only way for the curse to completely vanish is for any living witch associated with it to die. Yes. That boy, who should be 16 by now, is the newest witch. I am the other witch, and if I had killed myself before I connected that boy to your curse, unimaginable things would have happened. Hell on earth, the devil told me once when I asked. Actual living hell on earth. It will all go up in flames because killing myself at any point before today would have disturbed the cosmos and the balance system of life and death, she simply stated. Wilson swiftly rushed around his desk and grabbed the witch's shoulders, as his stomach lurched with shock and anger. What do you mean today? What do you mean killing yourself today? Which, what do you mean? He aggressively asked, his eyes wide and unblinking as he attempted to mask his wavering voice. The witch's lips cracked into her first smile after many centuries. Her smile was timid, remorseful, and dressed with sorrow. Her violet eyes did not pierce him when he stared intently into them. Instead, a glassy layer of tears formed at the brims. That bereaved smile was for Willesden and all her sons before him. It was for the few people who truly loved her throughout her lonely life. It was for the man she loved who betrayed her during her girlhood and left her alone with the curse. It was for the deities of nature that she secretly worshipped, although she constantly lived in fear that a witch hunter would see her and hang her. But most of all, that somber smile was for the witch. The boy who had been wrongfully gifted the powers of a witch, and who will suffer one way or another, depending on the choice he and Willesden made. Willesden, my time is up now. All my powers have been completely drained today, she whispered, her voice dripping with the beauty of a tragic melody orchestrated by violins and other elegant instruments. She raised her right palm to untie her bun and allowed her onyx hair to tumble down in all its silky glory. She shook her liberated head as the wisps of her string-like hair flew freely, like the wings on an eagle. She clasped her hands over Willesden's astonished face and cupped his cheeks, with a poised grace he always overlooked. I love you, son. Willesden's heart skipped a beat and time began to move slowly, splintering his soul. Time has always moved slow for Willesden and even more so for the witch. Time is a fickle thing, Willesden proposed. It flew by faster than a flash of light when he was enjoying something. It trickled dreadfully slow when nothing was flashing around his life. But when there were no distractions or boredom, when he was aware, he was fully submerged within time. Time gracefully curled its skeletal hands around his wrists during these moments and pulled him towards a dreamlike place, far away from the horridness and wretchedness of his world. It was something a mother would do, lead their child away from the disturbing reality. Although the journey to that place was difficult at times, as the weather was harsh and life was cruel. But when one arrived at that place, it was beautiful. Time was tragically beautiful. Why, you are right. There is no Satan because you met the devil, Willesden stammered, as he tightened his grip around her and pulled her close to his chest. Many people believe that Satan and the devil are one entity when they are not. The devil can turn a pagan into a witch, that's the difference, he added, lowering her to the ground as she gradually weighed less and less in his arms. You are right in believing so because you worship nature and her deities, he added, as her lashes swept up to stare at him with her sad violet eyes. Her lips formed another timid smile as his genuine words sunk into her, warming her soul. But you are wrong about one thing. You are no witch, mother. The witch's leathery lips parted with surprise as she blinked in their usual owlish manner. Except, this time her eyelids blinked extremely slowly, as they lingered on the face of her son. A teardrop streamed down her cheek and dripped onto the floor, splattering silently. Willesden squeezed his eyes shut and gritted his teeth, as her lower body slowly disintegrated. He clutched the black dress that she has worn for hundreds of years and rocked her back and forth soothingly. How horrifying that must have been, to be utterly alone for millions of years. How horrifying it must be, to have no one but yourself, in a strange world that is too big for anyone's own good. How horrifying, how tragic, and how strong you are, mother. How strong you are to endure this cursed life that you did not deserve, he whimpered, his eyes dripping with crystal tears. His heart slowed its beating as time gracefully curled her skeletal fingers around his shaking wrist. Thank you, Willesden, she murmured softly, stroking his wrist. Her bony fingers were surprisingly warm as they traveled downwards to caress the devil's mark upon him. As she disintegrated, particles, that were more like dark rose petals to Willesden, drifted into the air and intertwined with the ordinary dust. He held her with caress as she slowly died, and studied the woman he hated for 200 years. At that moment he couldn't recall why he hated her. It was most likely something trivial that happened in his childhood. Perhaps it was when she scolded him for running away from the forest, their home. Willesden's heart shattered as the times he brought his mother anguish repeated in his mind. A choked cry forced itself up his throat, as he desperately wanted to yell an apology for all the sins he had committed against her. But there was so little time left. What a wonderful mother you are. With every thump of his heart, another limb of hers disintegrated. Willesden shook his head furiously and gripped her tightly, hoping that would stop the impending death. His mother simply smiled at him, her violet eyes glistening with more freedom than it has ever had during their lifetime. The disintegration crept up her torso and the bottom of her dress slopped onto the varnished floor. "Mother, wait. Please tell me your name before you go," he sobbed, his tears drenching the woman in his arms. His mother sighed wistfully, a heartwarming smile twirling on her face. "That too shall be revealed in some time, Wilson." Wilson squeezed what was left of her tighter, and her mesmerizing violet eyes blinked one last time before she slipped away into death's grasp. Wilson's heart was heavy with remorse and guilt as he kneeled on the floor with empty hands. The only thing that remained of her was the black dress that had been gifted to her by the heroic King William. He didn't realize until she evaporated into the air and clutched her empty clothes that held no more meaning, that he was utterly alone. His mother was the only family in his life after all. He sobbed into her dress unceasingly, that was still fresh with her flowery scent. His tears soaked the black fabric and it washed away every piece of her soul that was latched onto it. A tiny lapse forced him to pull away, blinking lashes heavy with tears, before he collapsed again, his howls of misery worsening. The pain came in waves, minutes of sobbing broken apart by short pauses of recovering breaths, before hurling him back into his grief. Wilson Stevenson hugged the dress and stared at the ground where he held her in his arms moments ago. Time was truly a fickle thing. One moment his beautiful and tired mother was here, and the next she was gone. As silent tears streamed down his cheeks, he noticed that time was more gracious than death. Time had left him a gift, a single black rose laid upon the floor, where the witch once was.